Nice to have you back. We're chatting to Mansoor Parker, tax executive at Edward Nathan Sonnenbergs, and Andrew Gilder, also from ENS, looking at this carbon tax. Just before we went to the break, I was saying that so many people say this whole thing is just a myth. Why are we even spending all this time and money and flying people all over the world using huge amounts of carbon emissions to go and discuss?
Well, actually, I mean, that's an interesting point. That is going to happen less and less. In fact, you're seeing a lot of the international negotiations now happening by video conference. So let me answer that. It's not a good idea to ask a scientific question of a lawyer. So I will answer. I will answer in the way that the scientists I've spoken to have answered. The idea that a lot of people think it's a myth is in fact misinformation. There is a very vocal climate skeptic lobby group, if you like. And they're entitled to the opinion. But let's look at where the science comes from. All right. So we've got the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that effectively defines climate science in the world. First point. The IPCC have put at the last report they did, which was now about 4 or 5 years old, the next one is due next year, they've put at the likelihood of 9 out of 10 that human activity is enhancing and rapidly accelerating natural cycles of climate change. So yes, we do understand that this has happened in the past. The point is, it's happening much faster now as a result of our impact.
Can I throw a spanner in the works
here? Go ahead.
When you say human activity, one of those activities would necessarily be procreation. And procreation, to me, is probably the biggest threat to global warming. Are we not putting the cart before the horse here? And shouldn't we be looking at programs to limit procreation?
Well, hugely controversial. You might be interested to know that the whole issue of population has not been mentioned at the climate change negotiations until last year in Doha at COP18, because it is such a tremendously sensitive issue. So yes, you're absolutely right. But the point is, the climate change negotiations and what comes out of there is only one aspect, is only one of a very complex web of measures that we as humans need to implement to deal with how we're impacting on the earth. For example, there is a lot of activity under the Convention on Biodiversity. So you raise a very interesting point. It's a point that has been discussed and negotiated, but if indeed that is something we need to do, it will again only be one of the things that we need to do. So
there's a whole basket of stuff
correct.
We need to put in.
Last point about the IPCC is because it gets criticized by saying, from the perspective that, the science of the IPCC is not good science. Now let's understand what they do. They do not do empirical research. What they do is they synthesize the empirical research of 150 organizations around the world. So it's not the IPCC's view, it's the view of a lot of scientists. And this is the last thing. It's kind of amusing if you've ever spoken to more than one lawyer. The text of the IPCC report is the negotiated text, negotiated by 3,500 scientists. So 3,500 scientists sit in various rooms and they sign off on that text. Believe me, you can't get 3 lawyers to agree to the same text.
You can't get 2 in a court of law.
Correct. So you have to understand what the IPCC science is based upon.
Okay, right. Thank you. That was a very succinct explanation. Let's come back now to the effects of this carbon tax.
Could I kick off with the point raised earlier?
Yeah, certainly.
We discussed companies which will be liable to the carbon tax and those companies which will not be liable for the carbon tax, but which may suffer increases in the cost base because they'll be buying products and goods from entities who are subject to the carbon tax. So they'll be paying more for electricity, iron, steel, cement, other goods in future. There are a few mechanisms at their disposal. Number one, they could install energy efficiency equipment for which they could go to the Department of Trade and Industry and apply for a cash grant, which would help fund certain of those costs. Once the machinery is in place and they manage to reduce the energy usage, that energy efficiency saving that they achieve could be translated into a tax deduction in future. The provisions are in place. Certain regulations needs to be passed to give effect to them. But there are certain incentives and transitional measures being put in place to encourage companies to go onto a more energy efficiency path. And the funding for those cash grants and tax deductions will come from revenues raised from the carbon tax. So there is meant to be a recycling of these carbon tax revenues into tax relief measures.
You see, now when you start talking like that, all I see is auditors and lawyers making more money out of it. So that's where the carbon tax is going.
Well, let's look at that. I mean, the answer is yes. And it goes back to what I said earlier. To have simply a negative reaction because what you're doing is you're taking the bluntest possible view of this thing is not actually going to assist you. What you do need are advisors who are aware of the arena and so let me answer your question. A good tax, carbon tax and carbon legal team will be able to look at your business and to provide you with a plan that in the long run is likely going to save you money because bear in mind you're talking about reduction of electricity costs and so forth.
No, look, I believe it or not, as skeptical as I sound, I do buy the plan because I sat down and was shown numbers on putting in solar heating for our geezers at home, and it costs a fair whack of money initially, but I can see the savings on my Eskom account on a monthly basis. So I know over about 2 years those will have paid off, and then I'm reaping the benefit of those solar. So I do buy into this, the pattern that they're trying to almost massage this whole thing into. But it does seem that there's going to be a very hard learning curve involved in there, and I think people will have to realize that they're not going to see the effects of that for a while. This is a patience tax.
So you, in your anecdote personally, you're taking the longer term view. We have to take the longer term view. We have to understand how this economy needs to be competitive 20 years from now. If 20 years from now we start trying to take these actions, the pain will be enormously greater than if we start taking these actions now and we move in the manner that Treasury is indicating, which is a phased approach and a slow ramp up. So I think Treasury is acutely aware of the impact this is going to have. In fact, what's happening literally as we speak, there is a tender process going on for four a macroeconomic study of the carbon tax impact on the economy, an emissions study, comments on the design of the tax. There's a program under the World Bank called the Program for the Partnership for Market Readiness, and that work has been tendered and will be done and completed by about the middle of next year. So by then we'll have a much more detailed understanding.
Okay, given all of that, what sort of timelines are we looking at here in South Africa? Where do you think, when do you think we'll start seeing this huge, because it is a huge thing, start getting traction?
I see the first phase as being the ramp-up phase, 2015 to 2019. From 2020 to say 2024, the next 5-year phase, we'll see higher rates of carbon taxes being introduced. You'll probably see those tax-free thresholds being reduced, which would translate into a higher tax liability, thereby encouraging businesses to be more active in taking steps to reduce their carbon tax liabilities. And one of the issues that businesses are looking at is to change the fossil fuel mix by perhaps having cogeneration facilities, having fossil fuel as well as renewable energy, feeding the businesses with electricity. And the benefit of going the renewable energy route is that it is becoming increasingly cheaper for them to do so. And another point that's sort of dug away in the detail, which could be very useful for businesses, is that entities subject to the carbon tax can reduce their carbon tax liability by buying so-called carbon credits, which is emissions reductions generated by, among others, renewable energy projects. So if I have a renewable energy project and there's a certified emissions reduction and there's a carbon credit, I can sell that carbon credit to a fossil fuel-based generator which has a carbon tax liability.
But I mean,
so one of the implicit ideas there appears to be a transfer of wealth from fossil fuel-based generators to renewable-based generators.
Now this is nothing new. I mean, Kevin Leo Smith and people like that were looking at carbon credits years ago. One of the facts I heard that I found fascinating was one of the biggest carbon credits sellers would be people who have dynamite factories. For some reason,
possibly something to do with their manufacturing process. Look, I mean,
I don't know, but it just fascinating.
Yeah.
You've got making dynamite and you're selling carbon credits.
Well, because bear in mind, if you're making dynamite, it's a chemical process. You're likely to have emissions. If you change your process, you reduce your emissions against what your business practice has been, and that's
so
the
people
premise
have
of
actually
the
got to
carbon
start
credit.
looking at their businesses and seeing how they can leverage what they're doing and how they can offset.
You know, Jeremy,
They can actually generate a saleable environmental
Yeah.
commodity
Yeah,
out of
exactly.
an existing
Yeah,
business.
exactly.
You can sell nothing for money.
Look, I cut my teeth
You've got
on
30
carbon
seconds.
credits. I was responsible legally for the Durban landfill gas project. And I'm still gobsmacked to this day that countries like India and Brazil and China ran away with that idea, and South Africa is still sitting on its hands on that. There's an opportunity there, and the carbon tax is another element of that opportunity.